This is the Future of Information from the program in Science, Technology, and Society at Stanford University. In this lecture, we will look at the balancing of the values of the commons and commerce in scholarly publishing. So as we look to the future of information, we have considered three important properties of learning. First, that much learning is enabled through public support. So consider the work of monks and nuns that were supported through gifts, and that of university scholars that's enabled through public funding. The second is the communal aspect, that the intellectual output was available for all to share and benefit from. And third, that scholarship should be autonomous and independent, and free from commercial influence. So these values being known, with regard to public support of scholarship, that intellectual property should be accessible to all and free from commercial interest, how is it that scholarly works remain primarily behind publisher paywalls and the property of large commercial companies that make record profits? In this lecture, we'll look again to the past to learn how the scholarly values of academia interacted with the profit-making values of commerce at key moments in the history of scholarly communication and shaped it into the system it is today. Although the values of openness and scholarly communication have gained recent resonance, they can be traced as far back as to pre-modern civilizations, ancient Greek, Chinese, and Christian, where knowledge was not considered an ownable commodity. Returning to the monasteries of the medieval period, monks operated under the principle that knowledge is a gift from God and cannot be sold. The scribed writings of the monasteries were distributed, for the most part, free of charge. The same values were upheld when the universities of Europe that began to emerge in the 11th century began to take on the roles of custodians and hubs of knowledge once held by monasteries. That is, they maintained open policies towards their intellectual resources. Even after the emergence of commercial publishing houses, or scriptoria at that time, university authorities continued to recognize that knowledge was a gift from God and should not be sold too dearly, and implemented a careful regulation of the rates for the rental and sale of manuscripts. These values are represented in the example of the Bodleian Library at Oxford University. The library, as it endures today, was founded in 1605 with an endowment from Thomas Bodley, a wealthy former fellow of Merton College. The library, which had in earlier centuries gone through periods of decline, began to thrive through Bodley's patronage. In 1605, Francis Bacon gave the library a copy of The Advancement of Learning and described the Bodleian as an ark to save learning from deluge. In 1610, Bodley made an agreement with the Stationers' Company in London to place a copy of every book registered with them in the library. This status for the library endures to this day, with its designation under the Legal Deposit Libraries Act of 2003 as one of 6 legal deposit libraries for all works published in the United Kingdom. Even in the early 17th century, however, the library had to balance its archival and access missions with a commercial model to support its expenses. Users of the Bodleian had to buy a copy of the 1620 library catalogue at a cost of 2 shillings and 8 pence. Similar to Francis Bacon, most post-Renaissance scholars were independently wealthy individuals who pursued their scholarly interests amidst the duties of their main profession. In the mid-17th century, these gentlemen scholars began to create communities in the form of learned societies, which tended to be based in major cities and were limited to men from the upper middle classes. The Royal Society, for example, began as a group of some 12 scholars, including Christopher Wren and Robert Boyle, who met regularly in London from 1645 onwards, forging a College for the Promotion of Physico-Mathematical Experimental Learning. This group were granted a royal charter by King Charles II in 1662 for the improvement of natural knowledge, with Henry Oldenburg appointed as the society's first secretary. It was from these scholarly societies that the first academic journals arose to provide a more structured and regular distribution of scientific advancements, which prior to the introduction of the journal were communicated in between scholars through private letters. Although the first scholarly journal emerged from Paris in January 1665 with the publication of Denis Desallo's Journal d'Escavant, the forerunner of the modern scientific journal was the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society. Philosophical Transactions was the brainchild of Henry Oldenburg, the Royal Society's secretary who founded the journal in March of 1665. In doing so, Oldenburg transformed the scholarly tradition of open knowledge exchange into the scholarly journal as we know it today. Philosophical Transactions established the printed word as the primary mechanism through which scholars communicated the results of their work, providing a social registry of scientific innovations. The journal further established the means by which scholars claimed their right to the intellectual property of their articles by being the first to publish and communicate their findings. Systems of quality control that were imposed by Philosophical Transactions to review articles by society members prior to acceptance for publication established the principles of scientific priority and peer review as we know them today. Oldenburg's journal thus established 4 functions of scholarly publishing that have endured over the centuries: the registration of results, dissemination of work, peer review, and the maintenance of the archival record. As Henry Oldenburg wrote in his introduction to Philosophical Transactions first edition, the aim of the publication was to give researchers a venue to search, try, and find out new things, impart their knowledge to one another, and contribute what they can to the grand design of improving natural knowledge and perfecting all philosophical arts and sciences. Yet, despite Oldenburg's ideological reflection of communal values of the Academy, the practical constraints of the time necessitated commerce to ensure the viability of the publication. Oldenburg made an innovative move by taking advantage of the form of the short pamphlet, popular in coffee houses of 17th century London, as we see here. Oldenburg made an innovative move by taking advantage of the form of the short pamphlet that was popular in the coffee houses of 17th century London, as we see here. Taking on the risk of this venture by financing the publication himself, Oldenburg arranged for the printing of a monthly issue to be sold at 1 shilling each, and negotiated the printing of 1,000 copies. He believed he would break even if he sold 300 copies, indicating production costs of £15 per issue. Sales of 500 would thus afford printer and publisher a profit per issue of £5 each. Not handsome, but not entirely negligible either. Oldenburg never succeeded in gaining his living from the transactions during his lifetime. The most it had ever done, he noted in 1668, was to cover the rent on his house in Piccadilly. Yet, through his efforts, he established the journal as the principal means for scholarly communication, but also established its support by a viable and gainful financial subscription model that endures to the present day. A brief review of Henry Oldenburg's attempts to make the journal a viable publication also demonstrates that the balance between the values of the commons and commerce dates back to the birth of the scholarly journal itself.